The year 1860 closed not with celebration, but with a pervasive chill of dread that cut across the American landscape. Decades of simmering sectional hostility, a conflict fundamentally rooted in the institution of slavery, had reached a fever pitch. Though masked by political compromises like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, the deep division between the industrial North and the agrarian, slave-holding South was an existential wound. The North viewed slavery as a moral blight, incompatible with the nation's foundational ideals, while the South defended it as a constitutional right, an economic necessity, and a way of life that had built its wealth. This precarious balance was shattered in November 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, the candidate of the newly ascendant Republican Party, had won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. To the slaveholding states, his victory was not merely a political defeat, but a mortal threat. Though Lincoln and the Republican platform initially promised only to prohibit the expansion of slavery into Western territories, the South interpreted this containment policy as the first step toward outright abolition and the destruction of their entire social and economic order. For them, the principle of states' rights, the supposed right to nullify federal law and control their own domestic institutions, namely slavery, was the only defense. The atmosphere in the Deep South turned instantly from anxiety to defiance. Within weeks of the election, before Lincoln could even take the oath of office, the first fateful echo rang out. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina formally declared its secession from the Union. This act, followed rapidly by 7 other states of the Deep South, was a revolutionary rejection of the federal government. As these states coalesced to form the Confederate States of America, the nation stood on the brink. The American experiment, designed to unify a diverse people, was failing. The grand debate over freedom, property, and power was about to be decided, not by ballots, but by the devastating certainty of war. The stage was set for a 4-year reckoning. The secession crisis culminated not in a diplomatic handshake, but with the deafening roar of cannon fire. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate batteries ringing Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal garrison occupying an island outpost. It was the pivotal moment, the flashpoint that instantly transformed a political crisis into a violent civil war. For months, the fort had stood as a defiant symbol of federal authority within the heart of the newly formed Confederacy. Its eventual surrender, after 34 hours of bombardment, settled nothing politically, but initiated everything militarily. The war had begun. President Abraham Lincoln responded swiftly. 2 days after the attack, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection. This action, demanding that border states provide troops to fight their southern neighbors, immediately forced those states to choose a side. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which had been hesitant, viewed Lincoln's demand as an act of aggression against states' rights and promptly seceded to join the Confederacy. The lines of division were now tragically complete. Across both the North and the South, the initial mood was one of exhilarating, almost festive zeal. Young men fueled by patriotic fervor and a deep belief in the righteousness of their cause rushed to enlist. In the North, men marched beneath the banner of preserving the Union, convinced their duty was to restore the nation's integrity and honor the Constitution. In the South, volunteers fought for the defense of their homes, their unique way of life, and the new nation they called the Confederacy, firmly believing they were defending against Northern invasion and tyranny. This initial hopeful period of mobilization was marked by the naive conviction that the war would be short, a decisive battle or two, and the wayward states would return to the fold or the Northern invaders would be repelled. Uniforms were hastily tailored, and regiments were formed from towns and counties where men had known each other their entire lives. The profound tragedy that awaited these eager young soldiers, The 4 years of unimaginable carnage that lay ahead was then entirely obscured by the bright, compelling romance of the call to arms. The United States was now irretrievably a house divided, and the immense machinery of modern war was officially set in motion. The early months of the conflict proved a stark, bloody education for both sides, particularly in the Eastern Theater, which stretched across the battlegrounds of Virginia. The initial naive expectation of a swift victory was brutally shattered just 3 months after Fort Sumter. At the First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas in July 1861, poorly trained Union troops, accompanied by sightseers from Washington, D.C., were routed by Confederate forces. This early Southern victory delivered a shocking jolt to the North, instantly transforming the conflict from a short police action into a prolonged war. Following the defeat, the Union turned to General George B. McClellan, a brilliant organizer but overly cautious commander. McClellan spent months meticulously drilling the massive Army of the Potomac, convinced he needed overwhelming superiority before advancing. His slow, deliberate approach often frustrated President Lincoln. When he finally launched the Peninsular Campaign in the spring of 1862, aiming to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, he faced the tactical genius of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Lee, though outnumbered, used swift maneuvering, aggressive assaults, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain to repeatedly outwit McClellan, forcing the Union Army into a humiliating retreat from the gates of Richmond during the 7 days' battles. The Confederate successes instilled a dangerous confidence, leading Lee to launch his first invasion of the North in September 1862. This invasion culminated in the Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, and Maryland. Fought on September 17th, Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. From the early morning fighting in the cornfield to the brutal defense of the sunken road and the final struggle for Burnside's bridge, nearly 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Antietam was a tactical draw, but a strategic Union victory, as it forced Lee to withdraw to Virginia. More importantly, the immense scale of the slaughter underscored the brutal and uncompromising nature of the war. The sight of the blood-soaked fields proved the conflict would demand unprecedented sacrifice. It shattered any remaining illusion of glory, revealing the war for what it was, a horrific, modern test of endurance that would irrevocably change the nation. McClellan's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's army after Antietam, however, cost him his command, illustrating the Union's struggle to find a decisive leader in the East. While the Eastern Theater saw bloody stalemates in Virginia, a more dynamic war and ultimately decisive war unfolded across the Mississippi in the West. This region, encompassing the vast waterways and territories, were strategically crucial to the Union's overarching strategy, the Anaconda Plan. This plan aimed to strangle the Confederacy economically by blockading its coasts and, critically, by seizing control of the Mississippi River to split the South in two. The key to unlocking the West was the emergence of a relatively unknown, determined Union officer, Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike the tentative commanders in the East, Grant was a general of action and relentless advance. His early victories were pivotal. In February 1862, his forces, supported by gunboats, captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, forcing the Confederates to abandon Kentucky and large swaths of Tennessee. Grant's demand for unconditional and immediate surrender earned him a reputation for resolute victory. The focus then shifted to the Mississippi River itself. Grant continued his push south, enduring a brutal and costly surprise attack at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Though the battle was a narrow, harrowing Union victory, its immense casualties shocked the nation and confirmed Grant's tenacity. He refused to retreat, famously stating, "The devil is not whipped yet." Meanwhile, other Union forces began securing the river from both the north and south. Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans in April 1862, a devastating blow to the Confederacy as it was their largest city and most important port. This coordinated success, Grant relentlessly advancing downriver and Farragut controlling the Gulf, put the Anaconda Plan on track. By the summer of 1863, after a lonely siege, Grant would secure the final major Confederate stronghold on the river at Vicksburg, Mississippi. The fall of Vicksburg meant the Confederacy was literally divided, severing its western states and crippling its ability to move troops and vital supplies, cementing the Western campaigns as the strategic linchpin of the Union victory. As the Civil War dragged into its second year, the Union realized that military victory alone would not be enough. The very purpose of the conflict had to fundamentally change. Initially framed solely as a fight to preserve the Union, the vast scope and high human cost of the war eventually forced a moral reckoning with its root cause, slavery. President Lincoln, who had long grappled with the issue, seized upon the strategic victory at Antietam in September 1862 to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Taking effect on January 1, 1863, the proclamation declared that all enslaved persons in Confederate-held states are and henceforward shall be free. Crucially, it was both a moral statement and a masterful military strategy. While it did not immediately free those in Union border states, it redefined the war for the North, imbuing it with a moral clarity it had previously lacked. It signaled to European powers, who had flirted with supporting the Confederacy, that the war was now irrevocably an anti-slavery crusade, dampening their interventionist impulses. Perhaps the most tangible shift came with the official authorization for the enlistment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. Though initially met with prejudice and paid less than their white counterparts, nearly 200,000 black men eventually served, proving their bravery and commitment on dozens of battlefields. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry demonstrated extraordinary courage, validating the role of black Americans in their own liberation and inspiring the entire northern populace. The proclamation thus transformed the very nature of the war. It ceased to be merely a political struggle over federal authority and became a monumental fight for human freedom. For the Union, the stakes were now higher. They were fighting not just to save the nation, but to deliver on the promise that all men are created equal. For the enslaved, it was a beacon of hope, the promise of a new future that turned their quiet acts of resistance into an organized force that actively sought the demise of the Confederacy. The Civil War had shed its constitutional ambiguity and embraced its true, monumental moral purpose. Gettysburg, the high watermark of the Confederacy. By the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee felt confident enough to launch his second and most ambitious invasion of the North. His goal was to relieve the pressure on the besieged Confederate forces in the West and perhaps force the Union to negotiate peace. This aggressive move led to the single most decisive engagement of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, in Pennsylvania, fought from July 1 to July 3. The battle unfolded over 3 intense days, a clash of approximately 160,000 men. Day 1 saw Confederates push Union forces back to a strong defensive line shaped like a massive fishhook. Day 2 brought savage fighting at critical points like the Peach Orchard and Little Round Top, where Union defenders heroically held their ground against wave after wave of Southern assaults. Despite inflicting heavy casualties, Lee failed to dislodge the Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General Meade. The climax arrived on the afternoon of July 3rd. Lee, believing the Union center to be vulnerable, ordered a massive frontal assault against the heart of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This disastrous action, known as Pickett's Charge,
involved about 12,500 Confederate soldiers marching nearly a mile of open ground under withering artillery and rifle fire. The charge was an act of profound courage and profound folly. Union defenders decimated the advancing ranks. Only a fraction of the Confederate force reached the stone wall, and they were quickly repelled. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the true high watermark of the Confederacy. After 3 days, Lee's army had suffered over 28,000 casualties and was forced into a permanent retreat back to Virginia. Coupled with the simultaneous Union capture of Vicksburg in the west, Gettysburg stripped the South of its best chance for victory. The Confederacy would fight on for 2 more years, but never again would it launch a major invasion of the North, forever confirming Gettysburg as the definitive turning point of the war. The immense losses sustained there foretold the eventual, inevitable fate of the South. Life on the home front: sacrifice, struggle, and civilian courage. While the armies clashed on distant fields, the war demanded immense sacrifice and struggle from civilians on the home front, transforming life in both the Union and the Confederacy. In the South, the economic toll was catastrophic. The Union blockade, combined with the loss of men to the army and the destruction wrought by invading forces, led to severe shortages. Rationing became a daily reality, luxuries vanished, and staples like salt, coffee, and meat became prohibitively expensive or unavailable. Women learned to use substitutes, often wearing homespun clothing and becoming resourceful managers of increasingly scarce resources. In both sections, the absence of men fundamentally changed the roles of women. In the North, women stepped into factory and government jobs previously reserved for men, or organized vast relief efforts, working tirelessly for the U.S. Sanitary Commission to provide medical aid and comfort to soldiers. In the South, women managed plantations and farms single-handedly, facing the dual threats of economic collapse and potential Union invasion. Countless women on both sides, like Clara Barton, risked their lives as battlefield nurses, forging a path for women in medicine. However, the home front was not uniformly united. Political dissent was rampant, especially concerning conscription. In the North, Copperheads, Democrats opposed to the war, called for peace, leading to violent anti-draft riots, most notoriously in New York City in 1863. In the South, poor whites resented fighting a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, particularly after exemptions were granted to owners of 20 or more slaves. These internal divisions and widespread disillusionment, especially in the Confederacy, weakened the war effort from within. Despite the hardships, the period was also defined by civilian courage and remarkable endurance. Families dealt with the wrenching anxiety of casualty lists, the grief of loss, and the ever-present threat of disease. The home front was the engine and the moral center of the war, a testament to the resilience of a populace enduring total conflict. Their struggle to maintain semblance of normal life against the backdrop of national collapse proved as vital to the Sherman's march and the hard hand of war, total war. By 1864, the Union had embraced a brutal yet strategically necessary doctrine, total war. This was the conviction that victory required not merely defeating the Confederate armies in battle, but destroying the South's capacity and, critically, its will to resist. The architect of this devastating strategy was General William T. Sherman, whose campaigns aimed to cripple the South's infrastructure and morale. Following the fall of Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea. His army of 62,000 men cut a swath of destruction 60 miles wide across Georgia, severing all contact with the North and living entirely on the land. Unlike previous campaigns that focused solely on military targets, Sherman deliberately targeted the civilian resources that supported the Confederate war effort. His troops, known as Sherman's bummers, destroyed railroads by twisting the rails around trees, Sherman's neckties, burned plantations and mills, and confiscated livestock, reducing the region's economic output to ashes. The march was an unprecedented act of psychological warfare. Sherman intended to make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. This harsh reality shattered the illusions of security that had persisted in the Deep South. While individual soldiers were ordered to avoid violence against civilians, the widespread destruction of property and the resulting starvation were deliberate tactics designed to prove to the Southern people that their government could not protect them. After capturing Savannah in December 1864, Sherman turned his army north and marched through the Carolinas in early 1865, where the destruction was arguably even more severe, particularly in South Carolina, the state viewed as the cradle of secession. This relentless campaign of devastation effectively crushed the Confederacy's will to resist. With their economy ruined, their lines of supply cut, and their populace demoralized, the inevitable end was fast approaching. Sherman's total war ensured that the South would not only be defeated, but utterly broken, paving the path toward final Union victory.
The end came swiftly. Lee's forces were encircled and cut off. Recognizing the utter futility and devastation of further fighting, Lee made the difficult decision to seek terms. The historic meeting between the two great commanders occurred on April 9, 1865, in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The contrast was stark. Lee, immaculate in his finest uniform, met Grant, mud-splattered and dressed simply. Grant's terms of surrender reflected President Lincoln's desire for swift and magnanimous reconciliation. The Confederate officers and men were required only to lay down their arms and promise not to fight again. Crucially, Grant allowed them to keep their horses and mules, needed for spring planting, and their sidearms. This act of unexpected generosity, coupled with the provision of immediate rations for the starving Confederate troops, helped set a tone for national healing. The surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the American Civil War. The entire nation rejoiced. Lincoln, who had eloquently expressed his vision for malice toward none with charity for all in his second inaugural address just weeks earlier, was now poised to lead the effort of national reunification. However, this vision was tragically extinguished just 5 days after Appomattox. On the night of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. His death plunged the North into profound grief and created immediate uncertainty and bitterness regarding the future of Reconstruction, tragically leaving the delicate task of stitching the sundered states back together to less patient and forgiving hands. Reconstruction's dawn, the lingering scars, and the promise of a reunited America. The guns had fallen silent, but the peace that followed was fragile and deeply complicated. Reconstruction, the era immediately following the war, 1865 to 1877, was tasked with the immense, unprecedented challenge of integrating 4 million newly freed people into American society and readmitting the shattered Confederate states. The nation was forced to confront the lingering scars of the war, physical destruction across the South, economic collapse, and the enduring racial hatred that had fueled the conflict. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln left the nation's healing process in turmoil. His successor, Andrew Johnson, favored a lenient readmission process, which quickly clashed with the radical Republicans in Congress who sought to ensure civil rights for the freedmen and punish Confederate leadership.
This struggle resulted in a dramatic push for constitutional change. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. These amendments were the crowning legislative achievements of Reconstruction, laying the foundation for the future struggle for civil rights. For the formerly enslaved, this period, often called slavery's end and freedom's dawn, was a time of immense hope and crushing disappointment. Supported by the Freedmen's Bureau, they established schools, churches, and communities, and for a time, black men actively participated in Southern governance, holding political office. However, this progress was met with violent backlash from white Southerners determined to restore the old social order. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, and states enacted discriminatory black codes to limit the freedoms and economic independence of former slaves. Ultimately, Northern resolve waned. The withdrawal of federal troops in 1877, following a political compromise, marked the end of Reconstruction. This betrayal effectively handed control back to white Southern Democrats, leading to nearly a century of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. While the Union was politically reunited, the long-term legacy of the conflict meant that the promise of a truly equal, multiracial America remained unfulfilled, leaving future generations to fight the same battle for racial justice that the war had supposedly settled.